Thank you very much, Professor Miriam Altman. Just to remind our listener, you are Commissioner at National Planning Commission of South Africa. You're also Professor at University of Johannesburg, University of Cape Town. Thank you so much for accepting to join us on this podcast on the energy transition, hosted by ABiQ. Professor, I just want to ask you my first question, but first I just want to give a bit of background to the listener. National Development Plan of South Africa 2018, in its chapter 5, discuss ways and strategy to achieve an equitable transition to low carbon and climate resilient economy by 2030. My first question to you is, what does equitable mean, and can this be achievable in just 8 years?
Oh, well, first I should just clarify that I was a National Planning Commissioner between 2010 and was involved in writing the plan. And I was a commissioner for 11 years until last year in March. Currently, as you've said, I'm a professor of practice at University of Johannesburg. I'm a director of Altman Advisory, and currently I'm leading the development of the National Infrastructure Plan for South Africa. So just to clarify that. Yeah. So what does equitable mean? Equitable isn't equal. Equitable means you're trying to create a situation in which people have equitable access to opportunity. The just energy transition, therefore, the idea wasn't in 8 years, the idea had been between 2012 and 2030, of course. And we just haven't made the kind of progress we had hoped for. But the just transition, therefore, is meant to enable over the medium to long term, a shift away from coal, because as you know, South Africa is a coal-based energy.
Absolutely.
The majority of energy is sourced from coal. And so over a long period of time, actually, there would be a process of shifting away from coal and therefore affecting a just transition for communities, for business, workers, for people who are affected by that transition. So equity in that particular case would involve ensuring that the pluses and minuses, those who gain and those who lose their issues are addressed.
All right. Before I ask my second question, just want to give a bit of background to the listener once more time. But this time, I want to talk about the National Infrastructure Plan for 2015 that you as the lead author contribute. In this document, you sent it to me the other day. I kind of glanced through it. It says that the aim is to achieve an investment to GDP ratio of 30%, of which 1/3 will be provided by the state, meaning that, you guys count on the private sector to make up the remaining 2/3. Now, in the same document, the Commission has estimated the cost of infrastructure development in South Africa to be, around 6 trillion between 2016 to 2014. My question to you, therefore, Professor, is that what should the government do to attract 4 trillion rand of private sector money?
Okay, I think I need to clarify what those numbers mean. Firstly, 30% to investment GDP ratio is from the National Development Plan. That is a national target. It's not just related to infrastructure. And the reason for that is that I was part of producing that target. Countries that have sustained growth globally have, over long periods of time, have had investment to GDP ratios sustained around 25 to 30%. That is why we set that target.
Right.
We're well below that right now. I think, if I'm not mistaken, we're around 17%. So we're well below that target now. So that's a 30% to GDP ratio is the National Development Plan, of which we're at about 17% or so. It may be less than that right now. And then 1/3 of that would be expected to come from the state. Okay, and currently about it's at about 7%. So about 1/3 of that would come from the state, and we're below that target as well. Now that's separate from what we're saying in the National Infrastructure Plan. In the National Infrastructure Plan, we're saying to achieve the goals of our infrastructure plan, we would need to raise this amount of money. And now what I should say is, if one does a little bit of math and you see this year, just as an example, there is in fact a reduced amount in the national budget, which says, I may be wrong, but it's approximately 700 to 800 million rand devoted over 3 years to infrastructure, okay, by the state.
Okay.
Now, so that ends up being something in the region of about 260 million rand per annum. So if you do the math and you multiply over the period from 2016 to 2040, it actually adds up to that amount. Now that's not, yeah, that's not how we got to the number. We got to the, yeah, it just happens. But we got to that number based on, it was actually some World Bank figures that did some estimates of what it would cost to achieve NDP kinds of goals around infrastructure. But it's not outlandish. And the amount of money that is in the budget for infrastructure is actually a reduced amount. So previously it was around 1 trillion rand, and it's been reduced to, like I say, maybe 750 or so million over 3 years. So that's in fact a reduced amount. So I believe that if the economy started growing and the elements of the national infrastructure plan were implemented, that probably there would actually be more money. Now, what it is that we're also proposing, we're saying we need to have more blended finance. We need more private sector involvement in, to your question, we need more private sector investment in our public infrastructure. Currently, 2%, only 2% of public infrastructure is funded by the private sector. It's very little. And very little. And it's mainly in stuff like office.
Public-private partnerships?
It's more like, yeah, it's public-private partnerships, and it's mostly in buildings. So it's hardly in the strategic infrastructure at all. And it's partly because the regulatory requirements are just so onerous that, to be honest, people try to avoid doing PPPs.
Okay.
So we make arguments in the National Infrastructure Plan.
South Africa has a good PPP environment, you know, and a good track record handling PPP investment.
What are you thinking of? Like how train? What are you thinking of?
What I'm thinking is like you can pinpoint a lot of success when it's come to public-private partnership in South Africa.
What comes to mind?
The Gauteng.
Gautrain, the Gautrain. Yeah. But that's fairly unique. So the point is, we have a very sophisticated financial sector. We certainly have the capacity to be able to do blended finance. There is growing global capability around the area of public-private cooperation in financing infrastructure. And it's simply that, that public infrastructure in South Africa has not taken a proper advantage of all of those opportunities. So in the National Infrastructure Plan, we firstly widen out the thinking around PPPs to speak to partnerships and alliances. And that starts to look at the kind of thing that's being done in places like Australia, where you start thinking about partnerships in a different way, where you can start to deal with unsolicited proposals, you know, where you really start opening out to a more dynamic way of thinking about what that relationship could be, to thinking about changed procurement rules that maybe become less onerous and more conducive to these things. So we argue that by 2050, 1/3 of infrastructure investment should be financed by the private sector. So the bulk of it is still public, coming back to your question, in relation to public infrastructure. That's the distinction I'm making. And we hope that 1/3 of, probably in a large pot, quite frankly, would come from the private sector. But that would require quite a bit of capacity development, regulatory change, and probably a little bit more of an open mind to what's possible.
What are you thinking about when you mention a regulatory change, Professor? What come in mind? For example, creating new economic zones, special economic zone, or slashing the corporate tax for those companies? What are you thinking about?
Well, let's distinguish between foreign direct investment and investment just generally, and that for infrastructure. They're different things. So what the kinds of things that you're talking about are generalized ways of attracting more investment into an economy. In relation to infrastructure, which is what we were talking about, I'm happy to talk about the other also, but in relation to infrastructure, the public sector will drive public infrastructure by definition. And so there needs to be a regulatory environment in relation to public-private partnerships and alliances that is more conducive to the conclusion of deals, a procurement system that is probably less onerous, and also which reflects the long-term nature of infrastructure, that you have to be thinking over 10, 20, 30 years. And there's a tendency of having a short-term procurement system that is not aligned to the timelines and amortization timelines of infrastructure.
Okay, you mentioned something very important, Professor. Allow me to come back to it. When
Sure.
you said unsolicited proposals, and you took the example of Australia. Currently, in South Africa, are they allowing in the PPP law for unsolicited proposal? I mean, I assume that criteria like affordability, provide good value for money, optimally transfer technical, operational, and financial risk to the private partner, and being competitive must apply. But why you mention it? Should South Africa allow for unsolicited proposal? Are they doing it now?
No, it would be very difficult for the public sector to do so and then comply with the rules of public procurement. You see, it's not an affordability issue at all. It's to do with if the public sector, generally speaking, if the public sector is going to pay for and develop infrastructure, it would generally have to put it out to tender and competitive bidding. So there's a great discomfort with the idea of unsolicited proposals, and not really much of a framework that would enable that to happen. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just that we don't tend to have regulations that would enable it at this point. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other country does it, do it though. But my last question, Prof, to you, if you allow me, I know we just have 15 minutes, that's my last question. Coal is cheap and available in South Africa. We know it has come, contribute to almost 90% of energy or electricity in South Africa. Now, what are the opportunities for South Africa in the global energy transition? Why apart from the climate change issues, why should South Africa, with coal that is so cheap and available, why should South Africa transition? Are there opportunities for South Africa economy to transition?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if has come transition, what will happen? For example, now with power cut, would cost over the last decade billions of rand to the South Africa economy,
So there's a very big move to make that transition for a whole bunch of reasons, partly because of our global commitments, but also because our coal plants are in trouble. They were run down over a decade, and it's very unlikely that we would be raising money for coal plants. So the low cost finance and the drive is really towards renewables and other energy sources. So as we're trying to turn our energy utility around and invest in new energy, that has to come from some other place. So what the National Infrastructure Plan says is that it makes a point about what the energy mix should be by 2050. And it says that 70% of the energy should be sourced from renewables by 2050. Now, coal will play a very big role over that time. And there may even be new coal mines because we're fueling a very big energy system. But it's very doubtful that there would be new coal fired energy, which is a different point. So we have a major energy renewables procurement program. It's a world-leading program. It's considered to be, And each year we procure, well, you know, in our last window, we procured about 2.6 gigawatts, and there'll be another bid window opening now, probably seeking to procure the same. And the national infrastructure, yeah, and the national infrastructure plan argues that we need to do that every year in pre-advertised windows to create more certainty in the process. But that's the direction. That's going to be the main source of new energy in the system. And that's really the transition that we're going to see. There will be other sources, and certainly one will be looking at hydrogen and various, you know, green hydrogen, hopefully, and potentially looking at liquid fuels, maybe. The plan says we just need to explore, you know, thermal fuels. But renewables really will be the main area, and the opportunities within that therefore become, you know, firstly, of course, just generating the energy, but then we set targets for battery storage, for transmission infrastructure. We open up markets to enable embedded generation, which means that firms can generate their own, that municipalities can procure themselves without Eskom, and that we would be establishing multi-markets, which means that companies could just trade directly without Eskom. That would be absolutely transformative in getting some competition, and certainly a major attractant to investment of note. Yeah, it would make a huge difference to the country.
Yeah, I agree. Redstone concentrated solar power, I think it's in Northern Cape province of South Africa, is a great example of, you know, around 11.6 billion in investment. That's, you know, really good. Yeah. Anyway, Prof, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. You know, I'm a great admirer of you. You don't know it, but I'm telling you now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I follow your work. I also start following you intensely after your work when COVID-19 started. You I think you created, or you have created, that initiative. So I was kind of, you know, following all that you have been doing, you know, also send all of your articles, some of them, to my team, you know. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, and good luck with your podcast. It's a great initiative.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.